If you're hearing this somewhere between the hills of southeastern Kentucky and the shadow of the Cumberland Plateau, remember this: what you're about to listen to was never meant for public ears. It lived for generations in the margins of family Bibles, in half-burned court records, and in the guilty silence of people who chose not to tell the whole truth. Local historians still argue over it in quiet voices. Was it real? Was it embellished? Or was it one of those stories that's too honest about the times to ever be fully written down? Our story begins not with courage, but with a man whose life smelled of failure, sour whiskey, and wet Kentucky clay. His name was Silas Harrian, though folks in Knox County rarely spoke it kindly. In the autumn of 1847, Silas was 34 years old and looked closer to 45. Deep creases cut into the corners of his mouth. His hands shook most mornings until the first drink, and his back had the permanent bend of a man who had fought his land and lost. His farm lay 12 miles south of Barberville, buried in a narrow hollow so tight the sun only touched his cabin for a few hours each winter day. People in town had given the place a cruel nickname, Harrian's Hole, but never to his face. Some said the land was cursed. Others said Silas was simply the kind of man who picked the worst possible piece of earth and held onto it out of stubborn pride. 3 years earlier, tragedy had taken the only good thing that had ever softened him. His wife, Ruth, died in childbirth, along with the son she never got to hold. On the eastern fence line, a small wooden cross still stood where he had buried them, hand-carved in grief, weathered to the same color as the stones around it. That first spring after her death, Silas planted wildflowers there, trying to make beauty out of the ugliest life. By the second spring, he couldn't bear to look at the grave. By the third, the flowers and the days blurred together, and he stopped counting both. Life became a cycle of failed crops, mounting debt, and bottles emptied in the dark while the roof leaked over his head. Silas had been raised a Methodist. As a boy, he'd been taught that hard work and godliness would be rewarded, that the world followed rules, that God saw everything, and that suffering meant something. But the last 3 years had preached a different gospel. He'd worked hard. He'd prayed. He'd watched his wife and child go into the ground anyway. The congregation that once welcomed him slowly closed its doors. Invitations to Sunday supper stopped coming. Conversation died when he walked into town. People crossed the street rather than meet his eyes. He wasn't a villain, not exactly. He was something much more unsettling in a small community, a reminder that disaster could hit anyone, and that God's mercy did not always line up with the hymns, get pressed against his life like a tightening noose. He owed the dry goods store $47, a number that might as well have been carved on his forehead. Carmichael, the store's sharp-faced owner, had started with gentle reminders, then pointed comments, and was steadily moving toward open threats. Silas knew the pattern. First came warnings, then court papers, then the sheriff. He'd watched it happen to other farmers, land taken, homes sold, families scattered. Some pushed further west. Others sank into a poverty so complete they became almost invisible. A few just vanished, leaving behind nothing but unpaid accounts and stories nobody liked to tell in detail. His nearest neighbor, a tanner named Vernon Pitts, lived 2 miles away along a path that turned to a river of mud whenever the rains came. After Ruth's death, Vernon had tried to help. He brought food, offered to lend a hand at harvest, invited Silas to dinner. But each kindness had been met with silence, with slammed doors, with a man drowning in grief and whiskey who wanted no witnesses to either. Eventually, even patient Vernon pulled back. Now they exchanged only distant waves and stiff nods at the rear. Church function Silas forced himself to attend. Outside Harrian's Hole, the whole state was balancing on a knife edge. Kentucky in 1847 allowed slavery, but sat dangerously close to free soil across the Ohio River. That border turned everything into tension. Planters feared runaways slipping north to Ohio. Politicians worried about loyalty. Poor whites tried to find their place in a world where they were free on paper, but constantly reminded that they weren't the ones holding the power. Barberville itself was small, barely 300 people, but Knox County held 22 plantations, each with dozens of enslaved men and women. On the first Monday of every month, the town square turned into an auction ground. Flesh was weighed, teeth were inspected, and children were separated from parents while spectators pretended it was simply business. Silas had seen those auctions. He never stayed long. Something in them turned his stomach in a way he could not name. He wasn't an abolitionist. He didn't read northern newspapers. He didn't argue politics in taverns. He just felt wrong inside and solved it the only way he knew how, by avoiding town whenever the auction block was busy. Like many poor white farmers of the time, he lived in a twisted moral space. The law told him enslaved people were property. The society around him told him he was still better than any black man, free or bound simply because he was white and owned land. At the same time, he watched rich planters grow wealthy off labor they never touched, while he broke his own back on 40 acres of lousy soil and stayed one step from ruin. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 still ruled the land, and men made entire livelihoods out of enforcing it. Slave catchers and patrollers moved along the roads like wolves, sniffing out any sign of escape. A captured runaway meant reward money, some that could feed a poor family for months and buy social favor with plantation elites. A farmer like Silas was never far from the temptation to trade conscience for coin. A single act of betrayal could erase debts, restore credit, and earn him polite nods from men who otherwise barely acknowledged his existence. But if you'd asked Silas about morality, he'd have shrugged. He didn't think of himself as good or evil. He was just tired. Tired of the fields. Tired of the whispers. Tired of waking up each morning with a pounding head and a heart that didn't see much reason to keep beating. Sometimes, alone in the cabin, he sat with his father's old Pennsylvania long rifle across his lap, running an oiled cloth down the barrel and thinking about how fast it would all end if he just turned the weapon on himself. The Methodists have been very clear about what happened to a man who took his own life, and a stubborn streak Ruth used to call mule-headed kept him from pulling the trigger. If life wanted him, it would have to work harder to finish the job by November of 1847. Winter came early and hard. The leaves were gone by the end of October. Frost edged every surface. Old men in town said it meant a long, brutal season ahead. On the morning of November 14th, Silas woke in the dark to see his own breath hanging in the air of the one-room cabin. The fire had collapsed to cold ash. A thin skin of frost trembled across the inside of the single window. His head throbbed with the familiar ache of too much bad whiskey. His mouth tasted metallic like regret and old corn liquor. He reached for the bottle beside his bed, took just enough to stop the shaking in his hands. Dressed in worn wool pants and a jacket that fit poorly after too many hungry months, and stepped out into the freezing dawn outside. The hollow looked almost beautiful. Frost made the world sparkle under a colorless sky. The trees rose black and bare against the pale morning, their branches like cracks in glass. For a moment, it might have been peaceful if not for the heaviness in his chest. Then he noticed the chicken coop door swinging open, unlatched. He cursed it under his breath. He'd forgotten again. The fox that haunted his land never missed an opportunity. 2 birds were already gone that year because of his carelessness. He couldn't afford to lose another. He strode toward the coop, ready to find nothing but feathers and blood. Instead, all 4 chickens were still inside, huddled in a tight cluster, eyes bright with animal panic. The water dish had tipped over and frozen in an odd shape. Feed was scattered everywhere as if they'd been startled into a frenzy. The rooster, normally mean enough to spur his boots, crouched in silence at the back, staring past Silas and into the tree line. Silas followed that gaze. 60 yards away, at the edge where his cleared land surrendered to dense oak and pine, the woods seemed thicker than usual, darker, as if holding its breath. The trees there grew so close together that even winter couldn't open them fully. It was hunting land, or it had been years ago when he still had energy for such things. Now it just felt like a wall. Something moved between the trunks. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. Then his stomach tightened. A shadow shifted again, large, deliberate. His hand went automatically to his belt for the knife he no longer carried, and he cursed himself for leaving it inside the cabin. He was cold, half-drunk, unarmed, and suddenly very awake. Two figures stepped out of the forest. For a second, his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. They were women, that much was clear from their clothing, and the lines of their bodies, but everything else about them felt impossible. They seemed too big, as if the world behind them had shrunk, or as if someone had reached into reality and stretched them upward. Silas told himself they must be closer than he thought, that the distance was playing tricks, that the morning light was lying to him. But they kept walking, very slowly, very carefully. And the scale never changed. They were enormous. They wore rough, torn Osnaburg shifts, the coarse, undyed fabric plantation owners issued to enslaved field workers. No shoes. Their bare feet pressed into the frost-hardened ground. And even from across the yard, Silas could see blood and raw skin glistening where flesh should have been whole. The first woman was broad-shouldered and muscular, at least 6.5 feet tall by his dazed estimation, built like a normal woman, but enlarged, as if someone had taken every line of her body and increased it by half. The second was taller still, close to 7 feet, her frame powerful but trembling, moving like a person whose body was on the brink of collapse, and whose will was the only thing keeping her upright. Their skin was a deep, dark brown that seemed almost blue in the thin light. Their hair was cropped close to their skulls, likely cut that way so no overseer could grab it in a fight or a chase. Their faces carried high cheekbones, wide-set eyes, and a presence that felt regal in a way that didn't belong to Kentucky hollows or white men's fields. A jagged scar ran pale across the first woman's left cheek, old and fully healed. The second woman's right hand was grotesquely swollen, the knuckles split and bleeding, the kind of injury earned from striking something hard. Again and again as they drew nearer. More details surfaced, each one worse than the last. Whip marks laced their backs, some raised and old, others newly torn and angry. Their ribs showed through the fabric. Hunger had carved them down to sharp angles. They looked like people who had already lost too much weight before. They ran and had been paying interest on that hunger with every mile since. The taller woman's feet were mutilated. The soles were torn open, chunks of skin gone, dirt embedded in wounds that looked more like butchered meat than living flesh. The fact that she was still walking felt like an act of defiance against what a human body was supposed to endure. They stopped about 30 feet from the cabin and said nothing. The one who seemed stronger let her gaze travel over everything, the coop, the yard, the cabin, Silas himself. It wasn't a nervous scanning of a frightened animal. It was focused, intelligent assessment. Where are the weapons? Where are the exits? Who here is a threat? The taller woman swayed on her feet, close to collapsing, her eyes half closed with exhaustion and fever. Her sister's hand hovered near her elbow, steadying, ready to catch her if she fell. Silas knew what he was looking at, even if his heart begged him to pretend otherwise. Runaways, property on the hoof, according to the law. Human beings, according to the voice somewhere under all his whiskey and anger that still remembered. Bruce Bible, 2 women whose owner was almost certainly out there, searching with men and dogs and money on the line. Turning them in could mean reward. Reward meant debts erased. Debts erased meant survival. His hand drifted toward the long rifle by the cabin door, not with the conscious intention to shoot, but with the instinct of a man who knew that everything in his life had just changed and that whatever came next might draw blood. Before he could decide what to do, the stronger woman spoke. Water. The word was barely more than a breath, but the cold air carried it clearly. She paused, swallowed, and added, "Please." Her English was clear, precise. No heavy accent, no broken grammar. Someone had taught her to speak, to think, to carry language with confidence. Blood shone at the corner of her mouth when she coughed, a harsh, wet sound that hinted at sickness deeper than simple exhaustion. She wiped it away with the back of her swollen hand and waited, her dark eyes never leaving his face, and in that frozen second, standing in the frost with his chickens restless behind him and his life collapsing around him. Silas Harrian realized this was the moment everything would turn. The law, his debts, his fear, his loneliness, his faith, every part of his world tightened around that single choice. Walk away, and he could live a little longer as the man he'd become. Step forward, and he'd never be able to go back. He heard his own voice answer before he'd fully decided. "Come inside," he said, "before someone sees you." And with that simple sentence, the story of Harrian's hole stopped being just a tale of failure and grief and became something dangerous enough that a judge would one day order the testimony sealed, and a town clerk would write, in the margin of an official record, "God help us all." When people tell this story in Knox County, if they tell it at all, this is the part they lower their voices for. Because inviting those women into his cabin wasn't just kindness. It was a crime. A very specific, very expensive crime. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, harboring runaways meant 6 months in prison, $1,000 fine, and the loss of everything a man owned. For someone as poor as Silas Harrian, it wasn't just risky. It was suicidal, but in that moment, staring at two human beings standing barefoot in the frost with their skin torn and their eyes hollowed out by hunger, the law felt small and far away. "Come inside," he'd said. They moved toward the cabin like wild animals, stepping into a trap they weren't sure they should trust. The taller woman leaned heavily on the other, every step measured, deliberate. Like she was counting them one more step she shouldn't be capable, one more that could be her last. The stronger woman kept her body angled between Silas and her companion, ready to shield, to strike, to die first if she had to. Inside, the small room swallowed them, or tried to. The cabin was only 16 feet square. A stone fireplace on one wall. A rope bed with a corn shuck mattress Ruth had sewn. A rough table. 2 mismatched chairs. Ruth's Bible on a shelf over the door. Her name written inside in careful, hopeful script with the space for her death date still blank. The home of a poor man, but a home nonetheless. The women ducked to get through the doorway. The taller one stepped in, took 2 more staggering steps, and then her body finally gave up. She dropped hard, the impact shaking loose dust from the rafters. Her enormous frame folding as if someone had cut a string. Rose, the other woman breathed, dropping to her knees. She slid her lap under the unconscious woman's head and began murmuring softly in a language Silas didn't recognize. It wasn't English, and it wasn't any native tongue he'd heard from traders. It sounded older, rounder, like it had crossed an ocean long before she'd been forced to. Silas stood in his own doorway, one hand still on the latch, feeling like an intruder in his own house. He'd done it. He'd crossed the line. 2 runaway slaves were lying on his cabin floor. The law didn't care if they were wounded or starving. The law didn't care that one was coughing blood. The law only cared that they were property out of place and that he was now helping hide them. 6 months in jail. $1,000. Property seized. His mule, his land, Ruth's cross by the fence, all of it gone. For what? 2 strangers he'd never seen before that morning. He could still undo it. That thought spoke up again, sly and hateful. He could hitch the mule, ride into Barberville, walk straight into Carmichael's store or the magistrate's office and say, "They're at my place. Send your men." By sundown, the women would be gone. Silas's debts would vanish with them. $47 erased. Maybe more if the Talbots were feeling generous. "Water," the woman on the floor murmured weakly. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, then rolled back. A thin line of blood marked the corner of her mouth. The stronger woman looked up, her gaze steady, measuring him. Now that he saw her fully, the details landed in a single heavy blow. The infected whip welts, the thick scar along her cheek, the split knuckles of her swollen hand, the raw, shredded feet pressed against his cabin floor. This was not a woman asking for charity. This was someone who had already survived more than he would have, and still chose to say, "Please." Silas's hand slid off the door latch. "I'll get you water," he heard himself say. "And food." He crossed to the barrel in the corner, dipped a tin cup into the cold water, and carried it back. The taller woman rose, he guessed was too far gone to hold it herself. The other took the cup with her left hand, her right too damaged to be of use, and held it to her sister's lips. Rose drank like a person who had come to the end of her strength and found a tiny, unexpected pool just before the desert finished her. Water spilled down her chin, soaking the front of her shift. She didn't even seem to feel it. "Thank you," the stronger woman said when the cup was empty. 2 words, perfectly spoken, without accent. Not the halting English of someone who had learned only orders and insults. Someone had taught her language as if they'd expected her to use it. "Don't thank me," Silas muttered. "You can't stay." The words sounded cruel even to his own ears. Her eyes hardened, not in surprise, but in recognition. She'd heard that tone before. Help with limits, mercy with an escape hatch built in. Sisters. That explained the way Clara's entire body bent around Rose like a wall. Blood wasn't a metaphor between them. It was a vow. "Where'd you come from?" Silas watched her weigh the question. She could lie. Say a nearby farm. Say a smallholder who would never be able to prove he'd owned them. But when she finally spoke, there was only weary truth. Lexington. The Talbot plantation. That name hit like another blow. Even in Knox County, people knew of the Talbots. Old money. 3,000 acres. Hundreds of enslaved people. Brass horses. Fine tobacco. Influence in Frankfurt. They were the kind of family whose misfortune became everyone else's problem. Losing 2 women as unique as these would not be taken lightly. Lexington's 150 miles from here, Silas said slowly. "You walked all that?" "Most," Clara replied. "Some nights people let us ride in wagons. But mostly we walked." There it was. The thing people whispered about but rarely admitted to helping. The Underground Railroad. Not tracks and locomotives, but hands offered in the dark. Quakers who believed no human should be owned. Free black families risking everything. Poor whites who decided conscience mattered more than law for a night. For a mile for a plate of bread, Silas had always believed in property. It was the one thing a poor man had that put him above those with nothing. A fence line, a claim, a deed in the clerk's office. Property was supposed to be sacred. The world he lived in said these women were part of that. Livestock, inventory, assets. Except they weren't. They were breathing at his feet. They were bleeding on his floorboards. One had just called her dying sister by name. He turned away before the storm in his chest showed on his face and went to the small cupboard Ruth had once kept full. The larder, she'd called it proudly. Now it held the barest scraps, the last of a pan of cornbread, already going stale, and the heel of a smoked ham he'd been saving for Sunday. Sunday could wait. He brought the food back and set it on the floor between them. Clara stared at it for a long second, like she wasn't sure if this was a trick. Then hunger overruled caution. She broke the cornbread, pressing the larger piece into Rose's hand. Rose ate without looking, chewing as if she'd forgotten what it was to taste anything at all. Clara scraped every bit of meat from the ham bone with her teeth, working it down to polished white. "Eat, eat," Silas said, though they already were. "Both of you. I'll keep watch." He didn't know why he said it. Maybe because it was the only thing he still knew how to do, sit with a rifle and stare into the trees, waiting for something bad to come. While they ate, he took his place by the small window, rested the long rifle across his knees, and watched the narrow path that led to the main road. Morning drained into afternoon. The frost melted into cold mud. Water dripped from the roof in a slow, steady rhythm. Normally, at least one traveler would pass by in a day peddler's cart, a neighbor riding into town, someone moving between farms. Today, the road stayed empty. The woods felt wrong, too quiet, as if the entire hollow was holding its breath. Behind him, Rose's breathing grew deeper, less ragged. Clara's low voice faded into silence. When Silas finally turned to look, both sisters were asleep. Clara had lasted maybe half an hour sitting upright, watching him with those tired, evaluating eyes. Then, as if someone had cut a rope inside her, she'd slumped back against the log wall, still cradling Rose's head in her lap. Her mouth fell open. A soft, rasping snore escaped. Silas sat there, listening to the sounds of two strangers sleeping in his house. A labored rattle and a weary snore, and realized this was the first time his cabin had felt inhabited since Ruth died. Not comfortable. Not safe. Just not empty. An hour passed. Then another. Nothing moved outside, but wind near mid-afternoon. Clara woke like a soldier, going from fully asleep to fully alert in a heartbeat. She blinked once, twice, then her gaze swept the room, checking door, window, rifle, floor, sister. Only when she'd accounted for everything did she seem to remember herself. "You're still here," she said quietly. "It's my cabin." Silas replied, "That's not what I meant." He didn't answer, because he didn't have a clean explanation. He was still here because leaving would mean choosing, because he'd already gone too far to pretend he was innocent, because if he walked away from this, he'd become someone even he couldn't stand. Instead of answering, he deflected with a question. "Why'd you run?" Clara's jaw tightened. She looked down at Rose, brushing a bit of hay from her sister's hair. When she finally spoke, her voice flattened into something like a report. "Facts, not feelings. They were going to separate us," she said. "Master Talbot's youngest son married last month. He's going to Mississippi, a plantation near Natchez. His new wife heard about us, about how tall we are. She wanted Rose for a parlor toy, something to show guests, something to talk about after supper." She swallowed hard. She called my sister a conversation piece. Silas felt that phrase sink into him like a splinter. A human being reduced to the same category as a painting or an odd piece of furniture. Something to be pointed at, touched, discussed, then put away. "And you?" He forced himself to ask. "I was to stay," Clara said. "They like how much I can carry, how much work I can do." "Two women's work in one body," Master always said. He'd bring visitors to the fields, make me lift barrels and sacks just so they could gape. Called me his giant Negro, said there must be giant blood in my veins. Like to invent stories about where we came from. Told people our mother lay with some African monster. Said we proved there were different kinds of black people for different kinds of work. She said it all without inflection, like reading dull minutes from a meeting. But beneath the flatness, Silas could hear it, the slow, burning fury of someone who had been turned into a spectacle since childhood. "How long you had each other?" He asked. "All our lives," Clara said. "We're twins." "Born the same night?" The word twins carried both pride and pain. "Your parents?" "Our mother was tall," Clara replied. "Almost 6 feet. People said our father was taller. 7, maybe. We never knew him. He was sold before we were born. Master used to talk about us like horses. Said we'd be worth a fortune grown. Said tall Negroes make strong workers and good breeders." The way she said that last word turned Silas's stomach. He cut his gaze toward the window rather than meet her eyes. There were details he didn't want spelled out. Some truths were so ugly they felt like poison when you looked at them directly. A distant sound rose over the quiet and cut that moment in half. HES. Not a single rider. Leisurely passing. A small group. The rhythm was too tight, too focused. Horse hooves pounding the frozen road, harness leather creaking, metal jingling in between. Clara heard it at the same time he did. Her body tensed. Her head snapped toward the door. Rose, still half in fevered sleep, made a low noise and shifted against her. Silas rose slowly, his joints popping, the rifle suddenly heavy in his hands. He crossed to the window and peered toward the path. 3 riders. The man in front he recognized instantly, even from a distance. Vernon Pitts, his neighbor. Small in the saddle, shoulders rounded from years working over hides, his posture apologetic even when he wasn't speaking. Behind him rode 2 strangers with rifles across their saddles and coiled rope hanging from one man's belt. They moved with the loose, careless confidence of men who knew the law lived inside their pockets. Slave catchers. Silas's heart lurched into his throat. The world seemed to narrow until all that existed was the road. The riders and the two women on his floor. He turned back to Clara. Her eyes were already on his face. She didn't need to ask what the sound meant. She knew. Cellar, he said, voice low and tight. Under the hearth, now. He was moving before she could answer, crossing the room, dropping to his knees beside the fireplace. 3 floorboards there were older, looser than the others. Years ago, he had pried them up to dig a shallow root cellar, a cool place for potatoes and turnips. He'd never imagined he'd use it for flesh instead of food. Clara didn't waste a second. She slid her arms under Rose as easily as someone lifting a child, though Rose had to weigh close to 150 pounds. Even half-starved and half-dead, she was still enormous. Clara rose in one smooth motion, carried her sister to the hearth in 3 long strides, and waited while Silas pulled the boards free. The space below was cramped and dark, barely 4 feet deep and 6 feet across. Dirt floor, damp earth walls. It was not meant for people, much less for 2 women who could barely stand upright in most rooms. Clara lowered Rose in first, as gently as the narrow hole allowed. Rose curled onto her side with a soft whimper. Then Clara squeezed herself down after her, contorting her massive frame, folding knees to chest, bones pressing into wood and soil. By the time she'd forced herself inside, there was hardly room for breath, let alone comfort. She wrapped her body around her sister as best she could, their faces turned upward toward the gap where daylight leaked in. Their eyes met Silas's, Rose's glassy with fever. Clara's, sharp with terror, barely held in check. He dropped the boards back into place, fingers clumsy with urgency. It didn't sit right the first time. Or the second. On the 3rd try, they settled in, not perfect, but close. He grabbed a handful of ash from the hearth and scattered it over the seams, blurring the lines so the boards looked like they hadn't been touched in weeks. The hoofbeats were closer now. He could hear voices. Ernan's, lighter and uncertain. Another man's, smooth and too confident. Silas set a cooking pot on the hearth, purely for show. An ordinary afternoon. A poor man warming something for supper. Nothing to see here. Someone knocked. 3 sharp, demanding reps. The kind of knock that came from men who didn't bother to imagine you might refuse them. Silas wiped his palms on his trousers, swallowed, and opened the door. Vernon stood there, hat in hand, eyes already apologizing for whatever was about to happen. Silas, he said quietly, I'm sorry to trouble you. Behind him, the 2 slave catchers sat their horses like men who expected doors to open and people to obey. One of them, lean and hard-eyed with a pale scar above his brow, shifted forward in the saddle. His gaze slid past Vernon, past Silas, and into the dim interior of the cabin as if he already knew there was something inside worth finding. And under the hearthstones, 2 sisters held their breath, pressing themselves into the earth, listening for the sound that would decide whether they lived or died. The real story, the one that would never be written in any official ledger, was about to begin. The kind of knock, Silas heard that day 3 hard. Commanding strikes was the kind that didn't wait for permission. It was the knock of men who believed the law sat in their holsters, not in books. The kind that announced danger before a single word was spoken. When Silas opened the cabin door, cold air spilled inside, and with it came the smell of horse sweat, leather oil, and trouble. Vernon Pitt stood closest, hat clutched in both hands, his posture slumped with apology. Behind him, mounted on lean, restless horses, were 2 men who looked like they had been born for the ugly business of hunting other human beings. Silas, Vernon began, forcing a thin smile. Sorry to come by unexpected. His eyes flicked nervously past Silas's shoulder toward the hearth. These gentlemen need a word. The first slave catcher nudged his horse forward. His name, he would later say with quiet pride, was Hollis. He had the kind of face that might have once been handsome before bitterness chewed the softness out of it. His eyes were pale blue, sharp and cold. A thin scar ran across his brow, almost white against the sun-bronzed skin. Afternoon. Hollis said in a tone that implied he owned the hour. We're looking for 2 runaways? Negro women, unusually large. Tracked them this far. His gaze didn't waver. It swept over Silas's boots, his hands, his face, his yard. It was the look of a man who had spent years reading lies on people, the way a butcher reads the weight of an animal. Silas forced himself to swallow. Haven't seen anyone. A lie spoken plainly. Hollis's eyebrow twitched. Not surprised, just calculation. Mind if we have a look inside? Hollis asked. But it wasn't a question. The way he dismounted, swinging his leg over the saddle with the smoothness of long practice, made it clear he'd already decided. I do mind, Silas said stiffly, though his voice wavered. This is my property. Hollis stepped forward, his boots sinking slightly in the cold mud outside the door. State law says I can search any property during pursuit of fugitives. Fugitive Slave Act of 93. You can cooperate, or you can obstruct. One of those ends real bad for you. The other slave catcher, younger and jumpier, dismounted too. His hand rested on the pistol at his hip, his eyes darting like a nervous animal, scenting blood. He kept glancing toward the cabin window, then the woods, then back again. Men like him didn't think before shooting. They thought after. Behind them, Vernon looked like he wished the ground would swallow him. Silas, just let him look, he said softly. If you've done nothing wrong, they'll be on their way. Silas felt the room beneath him tilt. He had no power, no friends, and no excuse that could stand up to the law these men carried. The boards under the hearth seemed to glow under his feet like coals. Under those boards, Clara and Rose lay curled in a cramped pocket of earth, barely able to breathe, one of them half dead with fever. Fine, Silas said, stepping aside. The word tasted like dust. The men entered without hesitation. Inside the cabin, the slave catchers moved with unsettling precision. Hollis had done this 100 times, maybe 1,000. He didn't rummage or stagger. He flowed through the room like a man following a diagram, only he could see. He checked behind the curtain that separated the sleeping area from the rest of the room. He lifted the blanket on the bed. He opened the larder and sniffed the air, as if the smell of hidden fugitives lingered. He leaned over the water barrel. He kicked at a sack of old grain. The younger hunter tapped along the log walls, listening for hollowness. When he reached the hearth, the sound of his knuckles on the boards made Silas's heart stop. Funny place for loose flooring. The young man muttered, "Lots of funny things in poor men's homes," Hollis replied casually. Though his eyes sharpened, he walked toward the fireplace. Slowly, too slowly, like a man savoring the moment before he ripped the truth into the open. Silas stood frozen, palms sweating, gunpowder taste in his mouth. The rifle leaned against the window. Too far. Even if he reached it, he'd never beat 2 guns already drawn. And Vernon would speak truth to save himself. Just then a sound, a soft, muffled cough, rose, barely audible. Barely human. But in the cabin's breathless silence, it was thunder. Hollis's head snapped up. The young hunter's hand closed around his pistol grip. Vernon's face went pale. Silas felt the world collapse into one terrible point of decision. Hollis took 2 steps toward the hearth. Then a third. He was 1 board away from discovery. Wait, Silas said sharply. Hollis turned, one eyebrow raised. Something you want to say? Silas's mind raced, desperate and loud, searching for anything, any thread that could hold the flimsy lie together, long enough to keep the floorboards closed. Heard himself speak before he knew what he was. Saying, "You heard my pigs." Every face in the room froze. Even the wind outside seemed to hesitate. Hollis blinked. "You're what?" "My pigs," Silas repeated, injecting every ounce of irritation he could muster. "Keep 'em under the cabin in winter. Warmer than outside. One of 'em's got a cough. Meant to slaughter it, but sick meat don't sell, and I don't waste food." It was absurd. It was impossible. It was the worst lie Silas had ever created. Farmers didn't keep pigs in root cellars. Pigs didn't sound like dying women. And pigs sure as hell didn't cough like that, but Silas said it with the weary annoyance of a man too tired to defend his own choices. And Vernon God bless him, stepped in without missing a beat. He did mention keeping animals close. Vernon said quickly, after that fox trouble in September. Lost 2 hens. The younger slave catcher's trigger hand twitched. We should check. Hollis stared at Silas long and hard. Not at his words. At his face. Reading every muscle, every blink. The pulse fluttering at his throat. A long moment stretched. Stretching so tight it felt ready to snap Dot. Then Hollis exhaled through his nose. Tracks head east, he said flatly. Toward Bell County. We're wasting daylight. He turned away from the hearth. Just like that Dot, not because he believed the pig story, but because a white man on his own land had to be given the benefit of the doubt. Because beating down a poor farmer with nothing to show for it brought questions he didn't want. Because the Talbots expected results, not scandals. Because even a slave catcher had limits to the kind of trouble he'd start into. He walked to the door, nodded once to Vernon, and left. The younger hunter hesitated, confused, but followed his lead. A moment later, hoofbeats thudded down the road until the sound faded into the trees. Only then did Silas's legs give out. He braced himself on the table, breathing hard, feeling sweat drip down his spine, despite the cold. He had lied to the law. He had protected runaways. He had chosen the dangerous path, the one that could cost him everything. Dot and the stranger's part. He would do it again, his heart still pounding. He crossed to the hearth and lifted the boards. 2 sets of dark eyes stared up at him from the earth below, trembling, half suffocated, but alive. They're gone, Silas whispered. His voice cracked. You're safe. For now. Clara's voice rose from the darkness, quiet but heavy with meaning. Why? A single word. A world's worth of questions. Silas had no answer that made sense to himself, let alone to her. But the real truth was simple, for the first time in 3 years. He had chosen something brave instead of something easy, and that choice was about to bind their fates tighter than any law ever could. For a long moment after lifting the floorboards, Silas just stared at the 2 women curled in the dirt. Clara's breath came fast and shallow. Rose looked barely conscious, her fever-slick skin glistening in the dim light. The smell of earth clung to them, cold and damp. They were shivering not from winter air alone, but from the terror of what almost happened. Silas knelt and extended a hand, not touching, just offering. An invitation, not a demand. Clara hesitated only a second before she wrapped an arm around, rose and lifted her with the kind of strength most men could never hope to match. Silas helped pull Clara up and out of the cramped space. When she rose to her full height inside the tiny cabin, her shoulders nearly brushed the rafters. You're safe, Silas said again, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. For now. Clara braced a hand on the wall to steady herself. Her eyes were fierce, desperate, alive. He knew, she whispered. The one with the scar? He knew something wasn't right. Silas didn't deny it. Hollis? He'll be back, he said grimly. With more men? They'll search properly next time. Rose coughed, a deep, rattling cough that scraped through her chest like a rusted hinge. She winced in pain. Clara touched her forehead and felt the heat rising beneath her palm. Fever, the kind that killed, especially in winter. Silas looked away, rubbing his hand over his face. He could feel his stomach twisting itself in knots, not because he regretted helping them, but because he finally understood the enormity of the danger that now hung over all 3 of them. He'd chosen them over himself. Now he had to live with the consequences. Sit, he said abruptly, pointing toward the bed. Put her down. She needs rest. Clara obeyed, lowering Rose carefully onto the corn-shuck mattress. Silas could see now how badly the taller woman's feet were damaged, torn open, infected, raw. How her hands trembled. How her breathing wheezed. She was dying? Whether they stayed or left, she was dying. And somehow, he could not bear the thought. Clara watched him watch her sister. Her gaze softened, just a little. Thank you, she murmured. You saved us. Not yet, Silas answered. Not even close. He turned away and stirred the fire, feeding it small logs until it glowed hot and steady. The warmth spread through the cabin, breaking the chill. Then he mixed the last of his cornmeal with water and bacon drippings, stirred it into a weak mush, and warmed it in a small tin pot. Not a feast, but enough to give a dying woman a second chance at breath. Clara accepted the tin bowl, feeding Rose slowly, carefully. Rose swallowed between coughs, her eyes barely open. You should eat too, Silas said. Clara shook her head. Rose eats first. Stubborn, Silas muttered. Clara's lips twitched almost a smile. So I've been told. For a few minutes, the only sounds were the fire crackling and Rose's labored breathing. Then Clara broke the silence. Why did you lie? She asked softly. Why risk everything for us? Silas stiffened. The question pressed on him like a hand over his throat. He stared into the fire, watching sparks jump and die. I don't know, he said finally. But the truth rose inside him like a confession. Maybe because Ruth wouldn't want me to turn you in. Maybe because I'm tired of losing good in my life. Maybe. He hesitated. Maybe I wanted to do one thing I wouldn't regret. Clara studied him quietly. She didn't thank him again? She didn't need to. Something unspoken passed between them, recognition, perhaps. Or the quiet moment when two lives begin to shape one another. Unexpectedly. But the moment couldn't last. The world outside had teeth. We can't stay, Clara said, her voice steady now. They'll come back. Hollis doesn't let go once he smells the trail. Silas knew she was right. Every second they remained here, tightened the noose around all of their necks. But he also knew something else. Something neither woman would admit. Your sister won't make 10 more miles, Silas said plainly. Not like this. Clara's jaw flexed, hard as carved stone. She's strong. Stronger than anyone. I'm not saying she isn't, Silas replied gently. But strength don't matter when the body's breaking. Clara's shoulders slumped. It was the first time he'd seen her look uncertain. The truth had cracked through the armor she'd been holding herself inside. Then what? She whispered. What do we do? Silas paced the room, thinking. The boards under the hearth were still warm from their bodies. The door still carried the imprint of Hollis's knuckles. The air felt tight, like the cabin itself was listening. There's a place, Silas said slowly. North, near the Ohio line. Free settlement run by free black families, and those who help them get fugitives to Ohio, then to Canada. Clara blinked. You know where it is? No, he admitted. Not exactly. But I know the signs to look for. And I can get you close. Clara's shoulders straightened, as if a bit of the weight she'd been carrying shifted. But we can't travel by day, Silas continued. Too many riders, too many eyes. They're already looking for you. We go tonight. After dark. Clara nodded slowly. And Rose? Silas took a breath. I'll carry her. Or the wagon will? Clara stared at him, not with fear or suspicion this time, but with something like disbelief. As if she hadn't imagined any stranger would willingly put himself in that kind of danger for people like her. For us? She whispered. No, Silas corrected quietly. For the kind of man I still wanted to be. Clara looked away, blinking fast. She wasn't a woman who cried easily. She'd had tears beaten out of her long ago. But this time, something flickered in her expression, something softer than pain and heavier than gratitude. Silas stepped back and picked up his rifle again. Checking the flint, the barrel, the powder, there was no turning back now. He'd crossed the line. And once you crossed it, there was no return outside. The winter sun sank behind the ridge, dragging long shadows across Harrian's hole. The cold thickened. The world darkened in a few hours. Silas Harrian would hitch his old mule to an old wagon, cover 2 extraordinary sisters in rotten hay, and try to outrun the law, the slave catchers, and the entire Southern order. But right now, in the flickering light of the hearth, the weight of what he had chosen settled over him like a second skin. The road ahead was dangerous, bloody, likely impossible. But for the first time in years, Silas felt alive. For the first time since Ruth died, he felt like a man who still had something worth saving inside him. He didn't know that tonight would become a legend. He didn't know the price he would pay for it. He only knew this. They had to leave before dawn, or none of them would live to see another sunrise. Darkness settled over Harrian's Hollow in heavy layers, swallowing the last trace of daylight until the world outside the cabin became nothing but frost, shadows, and a distant snap of branches in the wind. By the time the first streaks of moonlight traced the tree line, Silas had prepared everything he owned that might give them even the smallest chance of survival. The old wagon stood hitched to Jackson, the meanest, most mule-headed creature in 3 counties, who seemed offended by the idea of being forced out into the night. Silas didn't blame him. The night was sharp enough to bite skin, and the air carried the eerie stillness that warned of bodies in motion somewhere far off. Following scents and rumors dot inside the cabin, Clara sat on the floor beside the bed, her enormous hand resting lightly on Rose's forehead. Rose's fever had softened slightly, thanks to rest. Warmth and food, but her skin still felt dangerously hot. And her breathing carried that unsettling wet rattle in the chest that made Silas fear she was walking the edge of pneumonia. Every few minutes, her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, searching for Clara's voice or her touch. Clara murmured to her constantly, sometimes in English, sometimes in that old, rounded tongue that felt older than Kentucky, older than the land itself. Rose calmed at the sound, even in delirium. Silas watched them from the doorway, struck again by how enormous they were, how completely out of place they looked in the tiny cabin. Yet it wasn't just their size that unsettled him. It was the bond between them, tight as rope, unspoken, forged by a lifetime of surviving everything that tried to break them. Part of him marveled at it. Part of him wondered if this bond was the very reason the world despised them. Strong women, especially black ones, were something the South feared. A sisterhood like theirs was a threat, even without chains being broken. When the sky had fully darkened, Silas cleared his throat, a quiet signal that the moment had come. "It's time," he said softly. Clara looked up immediately, her expression sharp, protective, determined. Rose stirred weakly and tried to rise but collapsed back into the bed. Clara didn't hesitate. She moved with that same instinctive strength that had carried them across 150 miles of country. In one fluid motion, she lifted Rose into her arms, her muscles trembling with exhaustion but refusing to fail. Silas moved ahead of her, opening the cabin door to a night so cold it felt like stepping into a bucket of ice water. Jackson stomped a hoof in protest, nostrils flaring, annoyed at the disturbance. The wagon creaked under the weight of hay burlap sacks, and the hidden space Silas intended for the women. Clara climbed into the back carefully, laying Rose down first. She whispered something in her sister's ear, a comfort, a promise, a vow, and then arranged her body beside her, curling protectively around her even as her own strength wavered. Silas covered them in layers of hay, then draped old burlap over the top until they looked like nothing more than a load of dry fodder bound for trade. Clara's breathing mixed with the rustle of hay, and for a brief moment, Silas felt the crushing weight of what he was doing. If the slave catchers stopped him, if Hollis saw through the lie, if anyone on the road lifted that burlap, it wouldn't just be the women who died. He'd be hanged for this, or shot where he sat, but when he glanced back at the cabin, the empty cabin Ruth once kept warm, the lonely grave by the fence, he realized his life had been ending slowly for 3 years. If he died on this road, at least it wouldn't be in silence. With a deep breath, he climbed onto the wagon seat, wrapped the reins around his raw hands, and clicked his tongue. Jackson froze, as if deliberately resisting out of stubborn spite. "Move, damn you," Silas hissed. The mule took a single step, stopped again, then another begrudging, flicking his tail as though offended by the situation. Finally, with a grunt of irritation, Jackson started walking. Pulling the wagon into the blackened woods, the hollow swallowed them. For the first hour, the only sounds were the creaking of the wagon wheels, Jackson's uneven breaths, and the faintest stirrings under the hay where Clara shifted to keep Rose warm. Silas stayed tense, eyes darting over every shadow, every branch that moved the wrong way. Cold sweat gathered down his spine despite the freezing temperature. Then, faintly, somewhere behind them, a horse's cry. A rider's voice carried on the wind. A sound too far to be certain, and too close to ignore. Silas swore under his breath and urged Jackson faster. The mule resisted but complied, picking up a pace just short of a trot. The wagon jolted, wheels clattering over frozen ruts. Beneath the hay, Clara instinctively shielded Rose from the bumps. Absorbing the blows with her own body, they followed backwoods, trails Silas hadn't used in years past, winding through tight stands of hickory and oak. Places where branches scraped the wagon sides like reaching fingers. When a distant lantern glow flickered between trees, Silas pulled the wagon off the path, holding his breath as 3 mounted patrollers rode past, scanning the bushes for movement. One of them slowed, lifting his lantern toward Silas's concealed wagon. Silas forced his face into a tired, irritated farmer's look. "Evening," he called before they could question him. "Off to my brother's place." "Mule's slow." "Got hay to trade." He tapped the side of the wagon bed. "Dry stuff. Last year's." The patroller narrowed his eyes. "Bit cold to be traveling hay at night, ain't it?" "Man's got to keep his word," Silas replied smoothly. A long beat passed. The cold air thickened. Under the hay, Clara held her breath so tightly that the silence itself seemed brittle. At last, the patroller grunted, lowered his lantern, and nodded. "Safe travels." Only when their hoofbeats faded did Silas release a breath that felt like it had been locked in his chest for a lifetime. They continued north, through the night. Twice more they hid. Once they crossed a shallow creek, water splashing icy against the wagon wheels. Every mile scraped at the limits of Silas's strength. Every bump on the road seemed to pull a new groan from the wagon's old frame. Rose drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering strange fever words, sometimes clutching Clara's hand, sometimes calling out names neither Silas nor Clara recognized by the time the sky began lightening at the far horizon blue turning to a faint, icy silver. They had traveled nearly 30 miles. Silas's arms and back were numb from cold and strain, his fingers barely able to grip the reins. Clara finally pushed her head up through the hay, her face streaked with dirt and fatigue. "How much further?" She whispered. 10? Maybe 12 miles, Silas said. "We have to make it before full daylight." "Too risky otherwise." Clara nodded, even though exhaustion made her sway. Rose was barely conscious now, burning with fever. With a final grunt of effort, Silas urged Jackson forward. The mule groaned, strained, but kept moving. The land changed around them, hills rising, the woods thinning, the smell of the Ohio River faint on the dawn wind. And then, just as the sun broke the horizon, there it was, the tree. The massive old oak, with a white stone at its base, the marker whispered about in every tavern rumor beyond it. Hidden in a small valley, smoke rose from chimneys. Cabins, fields, a church. A settlement alive with early morning movement. Free people. Watchful people. People who knew why a wagon arriving before sunrise mattered. Silas pulled the mule to a stop, his hand shaking with relief. "You made it," he whispered. "We're here." Clara let out a long, trembling breath. Rose stirred weakly, as if hearing something soft and safe for the first time in weeks. Silas climbed down from the wagon and walked toward the cluster of cabins, hands raised to show peace. Within moments, several figures approached, cautious, resolute, silent. An older woman with sharp eyes stepped forward, looking at Silas, then at the wagon, then at the morning sky. "You carrying passengers?" she asked. Silas nodded once. "2. Then bring them," the woman said. "We'll take from here." And, for the first time since November began, Silas felt the crushing weight on his chest ease. Clara and Rose were no longer his to protect alone, but his journey, his reckoning, his transformation, was far from over. The valley beyond the white stone oak felt unreal in the early morning light, like something carved out of another world, entirely too quiet, too gentle, too safe for the kind of terror that had chased Clara and Rose across the spine of Kentucky. Thin smoke drifted from stone chimneys, curling into the pale dawn sky. Cold light caught on frost-tipped grass. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crowed, oblivious to the danger that still trembled behind Silas's ribs. The settlement wasn't large, maybe a dozen small cabins, a modest wooden church, a few fenced plots where vegetables would grow once spring returned. But what struck Silas more than anything was the way the people moved. Not hunched, not cautious, not with the downcast eyes of those who lived with a lash lurking behind every corner. These were free men and women, free in bone and breath and posture. Their movements held a quiet dignity that Silas had never seen in Kentucky's enslaved people. And never once in the wealthy whites who held the power dot as the wagon creaked toward the center of the settlement. People emerged from their homes with expressions carved into hard lines, wary, watchful, but not surprised. They'd seen men like Silas before. They'd seen wagons arrive at impossible hours. They'd seen the weight that sat on the shoulders of anyone who came seeking sanctuary. The first to approach was an older woman with gray hair pulled tight under a head wrap. Her eyes were sharp enough to carve the truth out of a liar. Silas would learn later that everyone here called her Dina, and that nothing happened in this settlement without her knowing. "You carrying passengers?" she asked, her voice strong, steady, and without a trace of fear. Silas nodded. "Two women?" Dina didn't flinch. She just tapped the shoulder of a young man beside her. "Get the others. We'll need blankets, water, salve, and a place ready." Then she looked at Silas again. "Bring them out." Clara stirred beneath the burlap like someone waking from the bottom of the ocean. She pushed herself upward through the hay, blinking against the sudden brightness. Her hair was matted, her skin streaked with dirt, her body trembling from exhaustion and cold, but even battered and hungry. She rose with the regal bearing of someone who had survived 100 times, more than anyone in this valley could guess. Dina's eyes widened slightly, not in fear, but in recognition. She had heard stories, no doubt. Stories of two giant sisters who'd fled one of the richest plantations in Kentucky. Stories of bounty hunters, of desperate escapes, of women built like living myths. "Lord, help us," Dina breathed. "They said you two were tall. They did not say you were mountains." Clara ignored the comment. Her focus was on her sister. Rose was barely conscious, her forehead burning with fever, her breath rattling like something rusted inside her lungs. Clara slid out of the wagon and held her arms up. "Help me bring her," she said. Two men stepped forward, wiry, strong, used to work, but when they tried to lift Rose, they struggled under her sheer weight. Clara, exhausted as she was, finally stooped and gathered Rose into her arms herself, gritting her teeth as pain shot through her shoulders. She walked toward the nearest cabin, her legs buckling but refusing to break. Dina hurried ahead, pushing open the cabin door. Inside, a small fire burned, already tended. Clean blankets lay folded near a cot. Someone must have prepared it the moment they saw the wagon. "Lay her down here." Dina ordered Clara lowered Rose onto the cot, brushing hair from her sister's forehead. Rose murmured something unintelligible, her voice slurred by fever. A bowl of cool water was placed beside the bed. Along with a small cup of warm broth, Dina knelt beside Rose, touched her wrist, her cheek, her breath. "She's got fever deep in the chest," she said quietly. "Not pneumonia yet, not if we work fast." Clara's jaw clenched until muscles trembled. "She's strong," she whispered. "She make it." "She might," Dina agreed. "With help?" Silas stood in the doorway, feeling like a man who had wandered into a sacred space. Every instinct in him, every scrap of shame, guilt, fear, wanted to step back out of sight. He wasn't family. He wasn't trusted. He wasn't even safe here. He had delivered the sisters, but he was still a white man in a black settlement, carrying the scent of Kentucky's laws on his clothes. Yet no one threatened him. No one shouted. And no one called him back out to the road dot instead. Dina turned to him and nodded. "You did a righteous thing, Silas Harrian." He almost didn't believe it. Silas swallowed hard and nodded. "Thank you." "You saved lives," Dina replied. "We repay our debts here." Clara stepped out of the cabin then, breathing deeply of the cold air. She looked at Silas for a long moment, long enough that he felt pinned to the earth under the weight of her gaze. I cannot repay you, she said, but I won't forget you. Silas shook his head. I didn't do it for repayment. Clara's face softened almost imperceptibly, but enough. No, she whispered. You did it because you're the kind of man who remembers what mercy is, even when mercy costs everything. He wanted to say something, but no words came. So he did the only thing he could. He nodded once, roughly, then headed back to the wagon. His hands shook as he took the reins. Not from cold. From the sudden feel of being unburdened. And the new fear of what waited for him back home. Clara stepped closer as he prepared to leave. She pressed a small cloth bundle into his hand. Take this, she said. He opened it and froze. 3 gold coins, $20 pieces. $60 total. Enough to clear his debts. Enough to start again. Enough to make some part of this nightmare turn into something almost like salvation. I can't take this, Silas whispered. You can, Clara said firmly. And you will? You gave us our lives. We give you this. He wanted to refuse again, but one look at Clara's eyes, tired, fierce, unbreakable, told him she would not allow it. So he closed his fist around the coins, their weight a promise, a burden, a blessing all at once. Goodbye, Silas, Clara said softly. May God guard your road home. He tried to reply, but emotion clogged his throat. He simply nodded, flicked the reins, and watched as Jackson finally began the slow walk back toward the road, away from the settlement, away from the 2 women who had changed his life forever. As the settlement disappeared behind the trees. Silas felt something in his chest shift, a tightness easing, a wound beginning to heal. For the first time since Ruth died, something inside him stirred that almost felt like hope. He had brought Clara and Rose to freedom. Whether they survived from here was no longer in his hands. But for the first time, he believed they truly might. The road back to Kentucky stretched long and lonely before him. But Silas Harrian knew this. He had done something good. Something dangerous, foolish, and holy. Something few men ever dared, and the world would never look the same again. The road back to Harrian's Hollow felt longer than the journey north, though Silas knew the miles were the same. The path twisted between bare winter trees, the wagon wheels groaning under the weight of old repairs and tired wood. Jackson trudged stubbornly forward, each step slow and deliberate, as if the mule sensed that turning back meant stepping into danger rather than away from it. Dawn fully broke by the time Silas reached the outskirts of Knox County, the pale sun washing the frost-covered fields in a thin, brittle light. The cold air stung his nose and burned in his lungs. Every breath reminded him he was heading toward a home where questions waited questions. He wasn't ready to and couldn't afford to answer truthfully. He kept seeing Clara's face behind him, the way she stood tall even in exhaustion, and Rose's fragile breathing, the soft rattle still echoing in his ears. He didn't know if they were safe now. Not truly. The world was full of men like Hollis, ruthless, relentless, driven by money and cruelty. Even in a protected settlement, danger could find a crack. But Silas had delivered them as far as he could. Beyond that point, their fate rested in hands stronger and wiser than his, every mile closer to his own. Land brought back the reality of what he'd done. He had broken the law, lied to slave catchers, shielded fugitives, carried them across half the county. It didn't matter that it was moral. It didn't matter that it was right. The South didn't measure righteousness. It measured obedience. By mid-morning, Harrian's Hollow came into view, the familiar cluster of gray trees. The thin line of smoke curling from his cabin's crooked chimney, the sagging chicken coop, the mule pen. Everything looked the same as it always had, yet Silas felt different, unsettled, altered in some way he couldn't name. When he stepped down from the wagon, his legs nearly buckled. Exhaustion dug into his bones. He hadn't slept in almost 24 hours. His shirt was stiff with sweat and cold air, his hands chafed raw by rains, and his eyes burned from staring too, long into darkness. But the world didn't pause to let him rest. He barely had time to unhitch. Jackson when he spotted movement through the trees. A horse, then another. Two men riding slowly past the edge of his property, searching, watching, their hats low, their eyes scanning the ground like predators. Slave patrollers. Again. The third time in 2 days, his heart climbed into his throat. They didn't stop at his cabin this time. They didn't knock. They simply observed the land, then nudged their horses forward and continued toward the next property. But their presence alone was a warning. Hollis wasn't done searching. The Talbots weren't done demanding. And as long as he lived in this county, Silas Harrian would live under suspicion. Inside the cabin. Everything felt colder than usual. Ruth's Bible still sat on the shelf above the door. The bed still sagged under its corn shuck mattress. The fire had burned low to ash. The silence inside these walls felt heavier now, as if the cabin itself knew what Silas had carried through its doorway. Just a day before, he set the food bundle Dina had given him on the table, finally allowing himself to unwrap the second item she had pressed into his hand. When he opened it, he found a small wooden cross symbol, carved by hand, polished by decades of fingers. A symbol of trust. A reminder that he had joined something larger than his own small life. Even if only for one night, Silas sat down heavily at the table. The gold coins Clara had given him still warm from being held tight in his fist. He rolled them between his fingers, letting their weight settle into his reality. He knew how dangerous it was to have them. These were Talbot coins stolen from a planter's son. If anyone traced them back to him, he would be ruined. But he needed them. More than he'd ever needed anything. Debts, repairs, seed, everything his farm required to stay. A life was suddenly possible. He stared at the coins for a long time before tucking them deep. Inside a hollow board beneath the bookshelf. Far from where Carmichael or any patrolman might think to look. The day passed slowly. Silas repaired the chicken coop because work was the only thing that steadied his mind. He fixed a leak in the roof, chopped wood until his arms trembled from fatigue. Anything to keep from thinking about hoofbeats returning down the road. Anything to drown out the echo of Rose's fevered breathing, but tension twisted through every moment. Any sound could be Hollis returning. Any figure on the road could be a neighbor ready to ask the wrong question. The world had narrowed to the space between his ribs and the weight pressed against them. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the cold deepened, Vernon Pitts appeared at the edge of the yard. He didn't call out. He didn't wave. He just stood silently for a moment, hat in hand. Before taking a few steps forward, "Silas," Vernon began, his voice tight, words traveling fast. Silas wiped sweat and dirt from his brow. "What word?" "That the Talbot women might have passed this way. That Hollis suspects you lied to him." Vernon hesitated. "He's telling folks he heard something under your floorboards. Says you got pigs down there." Silas's jaw clenched. "I do." Vernon's eyes showed he knew it was a lie. Maybe he'd known from the beginning. Maybe he had chosen not to see. "I ain't here to accuse you," he said quietly. "Or help you. I can't risk that." "But, Silas," he swallowed hard, struggling with what he wanted to say. "Just be careful." Silas nodded once. "I know." Vernon looked like he wanted to say more, something about friendship or fear, or guilt, but instead he simply lifted a hand in a half wave and walked away. The distance between them felt permanent now. Not hostile, just carved out by truth too dangerous to speak. That night, Silas lay awake on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. Every crack of wood, every sigh of wind, every distant animal cry made his pulse jolt. He knew Hollis would return eventually. He knew questions would keep coming, but he also knew this. He would lie again. Even if it killed him, some decisions, once made, remade a man completely. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. He was no longer the man who watched the world break others without lifting a hand. He wasn't even the man he'd been yesterday. He was someone else now, someone he hoped Ruth would recognize, and as he drifted finally into uneasy sleep, One truth carried him through the darkness. He had done the right thing, and he would live with whatever came next. Winter settled deep into the hollow that year, burying Knox County under a brittle layer of frost that cracked beneath every step. Silas Harrian felt the cold move through his bones in a way it never had before. Perhaps it was age. Perhaps it was fear. Or perhaps it was the weight of the secret he now carried, a lone one he could never speak aloud in a world that punished mercy with the same ruthlessness as murder. Days passed with the steady rhythm of survival. Silas repaired fences, fed Jackson, rebuilt the sagging roof plank by plank. He woke each morning expecting to see Hollis riding down the road, or Carmichael demanding answers, or Vernon returning with worry carved in his face. But the days remained quiet. The world, strangely, did not collapse then. Slowly, whispers began to drift through town like wind through bare branches. The Talbot runaways were still missing. Bounty hunters had searched from Lexington to the Ohio River. Patrollers scoured the hills day and night. But Clara and Rose had vanished as if the earth itself had opened to swallow them. Silas avoided town as much as possible. But when he finally walked into Carmichael's dry goods store weeks later, with 3 gold coins in his pocket, every head in the store lifted. Eyes lingered on him, curious, suspicious, confused. No one asked directly where the money had come from. People in Kentucky rarely asked questions they didn't want answers to. Carmichael took the payment, marked his ledger, and handed Silas the receipt with a stiff nod. The man's narrow face looked unsettled, as if holding those gold coins felt like grasping a ghost story with no ending. Silas left without another word. With his debts cleared, something in his chest loosened. He could breathe again just a little. He bought seed in spring, plowed fields that had sat bitter and stubborn for years, and watched them sprout green under the warm March rain. For the first time since Ruth's death, hope found its way into his daily thoughts. Not the loud kind, not the foolish kind. A quiet hope like a candle's flame in an empty room. And he began to change. He stopped drinking. Not because anyone urged him to, but because for the first time in years he wanted to see the world clearly. He wanted to live long enough to see what would grow from the risk he had taken. He wanted to feel worthy of the trust Clara and Rose had placed in him. The seasons turned. He remarried. Margaret, a quiet widow with soft eyes and a practical mind, came into his life not from love at first sight, but from the shared understanding that loneliness could be a cold that killed a person slowly. Together, they built something steady, something functional, something kind. It was not the blazing love he'd had with Ruth, but it was a warmth he was grateful for. Children came. 3 daughters who filled the cabin with laughter. Sarah, Ellen, and Mary. Silas raised them with patience he never knew he possessed. He patched their dresses, read them stories, taught them how to plant seeds in straight rows and how to chop wood without losing fingers. At night, when they fell asleep, curled together like kittens, he felt something he had thought forever lost purpose. Yet, through all those years, he never forgot that November morning. He never forgot the sound of Rose's breath rattling in his cabin. Never forgot Clara kneeling over her like a guardian forged from iron and will. Never forgot the weight of those gold coins warm in his palm. Never forgot the single question Clara had asked why. He never answered her. But the answer revealed itself in the years that followed. He had done it because he could not bear to live one more day as the kind of man who watched suffering and looked away. Because Ruth had believed him to be a better man than he had ever proven himself to be. Because the world demanded cruelty, and he was finally desperately ready to refuse. Time, as it always does, moved forward. The war came. The war ended. Slavery fell. Men who once hunted people now walked the streets like ghosts stripped of purpose. New laws rose, new freedoms, new fears. The world changed around Silas, and still he remained quiet about his part in a story no one else would ever claim. He grew old. The lines deepened around his eyes. His daughters married. Margaret aged beside him, her hair turning silver. And one crisp autumn morning in 1880, Silas died peacefully in his sleep, hands folded on his chest. Face softened by something close to peace. At his funeral. Townsfolk spoke of faith, perseverance, and decency. No one spoke of the runaways. No one spoke of the nail-biting night when a farmer defied the world around him. No one knew that Silas Harrian's proudest moment was one he never shared, but someone else knew. As the mourners drifted away from the grave. An elderly black woman stepped forward from the shadows beside the tree line. She walked with a cane, her back slightly bent with age, but she still stood close to 6 feet tall, impossibly tall for her years. Her skin was dark, weathered, and her eyes were sharp enough to cut through memory itself. Margaret turned toward her, startled. "Can I help you, ma'am?" The woman shook her head gently. "No, I came to pay my respects." "Did you know my husband?" A soft smile touched the woman's lips, half grief, half gratitude. "Once," she said quietly. "A long time ago. In another life." Before Margaret could ask more, the woman knelt with great effort beside Ruth's old grave. She placed a small cloth bundle on the stone. When Margaret stepped closer, the woman straightened slowly and whispered, "Tell his daughters their father saved lives. Tell them he mattered." And then, before anyone could stop her, she walked away, vanishing into the cluster of trees. As if swallowed by time itself, Margaret opened the cloth bundle with trembling hands. Inside was a single $20 gold coin shining, despite its age. A symbol, a thank you, a promise fulfilled. Margaret clutched it to her chest, tears rising in her eyes. She didn't understand the full story. Not yet. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her husband had carried a secret goodness inside him, one powerful enough to echo across 30 years and hundreds of miles. A goodness that had saved 2 women and, in doing so, saved him. And in the end. That was the truth Silas Harrian carried into the grave, the truth history would never record, but one that lived on through the quiet gratitude of those he had helped. Because sometimes the most heroic acts happen in silence. Sometimes courage leaves no monument, but a single coin on a grave. And sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we never tell.